Well, hello and welcome to the Connecticut Mirror's 2025 Legislative Preview. I'm John Dankosky. As we celebrate our 15th year of nonprofit journalism, it's an annual tradition to kick off the legislative session with a man who has covered a lot of them. The Connecticut Mirror's Capitol Bureau Chief, Mark Pazniokas. Now, before we get started, I'd like to give some thanks to our sponsors who helped to make this possible. Our presenting sponsor is the Mohegan Tribe. Our accountability sponsors are Eversource and CBIA. Publishing sponsors Express Strategies, Clifton Larson Allen, Hinckley Allen, Rowthorn Law LLC, and the Causeway Agency. And sponsorships are available for future events. You can contact Robert DeJoy at the Connecticut Mirror if you'd like to sponsor one of these events or some future event. Now, we do have some future events lined up. Next Wednesday, in the same space, you can join me for Keith Faniff's Big Budget Review. It's the place to get answers to all of your questions about fiscal guardrails in easily digestible metaphors. And Keith, of course, brings a lot of knowledge about the state budget, and he can join you with some of those answers next Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. Our colleague Erica Phillips has a great new series called This Could Work, where she talks to local entrepreneurs. You can check out ctmirror.org for more information. And of course, I'll be coming back with a year's worth of live sit downs with political leaders in a series we call In the Room. More information on that coming up soon. Okay, on to tonight's event. Are you ready, Paz?
I am, but we should first warn people that Keith's budget presentation does involve profanity and some nudity.
We should. It's PG-13, I think. Is how we have it rated. We are going to give you a chance to ask questions of Mark Pazniokas. You probably know how this works. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of this Zoom page. You can ask a question there. Do have a couple of requests, though. Some of these come from Mark. Please keep the questions relatively brief. And let's not turn this into a game of Stump the Paz. If you're asking about specific legislation, please briefly describe what you're talking about, and not just by bill number. That probably happens, Paz, right? People come up to you and say, what do you think about SB 502? And you're like, I don't know what the hell SB 502 is, right? I mean, it'd be nice to have a little bit of context.
By the end of the session, I do know some of the key bill numbers, and it will mean something. But this time of year, when there are almost 3,100 bills that have been filed in the last couple of weeks, please don't play that game with me tonight.
Okay, well, that's a good place to start, I think. So 3,100 bills, is that like a normal number for this far into the legislative session?
It's a little heavy. This is the longer of the two sessions. The Connecticut General Assembly meets for 3 months in the even number years and 5 months in the odd number years. And the odd number years is when they do the biennial budget. So that's a big part of what they're doing. But yeah, it's a lot of legislation that comes in. There's a lot of duplication because, if there is a topic that is a top of mind people, you're going to have more than one legislator deciding there ought to be a law. And therefore, you'll see many bills that say the same thing, some of them quite serious, some of them a little bit lighter. There are a dozen bills that were filed that would ban transgender women and girls from participating in women's and girls' sports, for example. There's a whole bunch of immigration bills. There tends to be a fair amount of duplication, and they'll winnow it out. Where we are right now is all this stuff gets referred to the committees of cognizance, which is just, the ones that have jurisdiction, and the stuff is usually pretty self-explanatory. Anything with money goes to approps, and taxes with finance, and so forth. And then there's a winnowing process. The committees will vote whether or not a certain bill will clear that first hurdle, which is, will it be drafted and will it be raised for a public hearing? And that's pretty much what's going on now. The public hearings have begun, but much of what we're going to see in the next 2 months is going to be this process of
Mhm.
preparing bills for consideration on the floor of the House and Senate.
So what are the sorts of things that at this point you look for? Because obviously, as I said, you've been through a few of these before. It isn't your first rodeo, I suppose. So uh, are you looking for specific trends, or are there certain things about the way that legislation is coming in at this time right now, the session, that tells you something about either the policymaking, the politics, the strengths or weaknesses of any party? Like, what is it you're looking for right at this moment?
So this, I don't think is going to surprise anybody, but my antenna is out looking for things that overlap or coincide with President Trump's agenda. One of the things that I like to look for in legislative sessions, other than, what are the impact and the import of the individual bills, but what do these sessions say about the current state of play, about the identity of the political parties in Connecticut? This has been a very dynamic and volatile thing in Connecticut. A really quick review. When Donald Trump took office the first time, the Connecticut General Assembly was pretty much 50-50 between Democrats and Republicans. People forget that because this is overall a blue state. But the Connecticut Senate was evenly divided, and the House, the Republicans were only five seats short of a majority. That lasted for 2 years until the midterm election of 2018. And that was a disaster for the Republicans. And things have not gone well since. In November, Democrats won majorities of 102 to 49 in the House and 25 to 11 in the Senate. So that's the state of play right now with a Democratic governor, albeit one who is at odds at times with elements of his own party. There are some Republicans who might bristle at this description, but by Connecticut standards, Ned Lamont is a fiscal centrist. He is certainly with labor on many bills, but he is certainly digging in on spending caps. We have a volatility cap. We have
I,
a
I
revenue
think this
cap.
this this far into Ned Lamont's political career, I don't think that that's a particularly controversial thing to say, that he is a centrist, at
Well,
least from an economic standpoint, right?
yeah, I do hear from people from time to time, how dare you? I said, okay, there are people who think he's a closet communist, but we'll let that one go.
So okay, so it hasn't been a good time for the Connecticut Republican Party since Donald Trump took office the first time. So before we get into some of the specifics of, as you say, the Trump agenda, which for people watching at home sort of feels like this: all over the place. There's a bunch of stuff happening. We don't know what to react to, right? Before we get to that, how exactly are Connecticut Republicans thinking about their place in the world right now? So Donald Trump hasn't done very much for them, at least from a political standpoint, but clearly some of the legislation that we've seen that you've already outlined has sort of towed the line in terms of things that Donald Trump wants to see happen at both state houses and also in Washington.
Yes, and in Connecticut, it's not that all of a sudden the Republicans, who in Trump's first term, many elected Republicans kept a healthy, respectful distance from the
Mm-hmm.
president. It just seemed to be the safest place to be. Um, this time, the House takes, for example, the House Republican leadership. They have a legislative package which includes immigration. There are two immigration bills. One would punish municipalities that do not cooperate to various degrees with federal immigration agents who are trying to detain undocumented immigrants and eventually deport them. Um, there's the legislation again on transgender issues. There are proposed prohibitions on gender affirming treatments, such as drugs that are puberty blockers, and then surgeries, particularly. And these are all geared at barring treatments of people who are transgender or diagnosed as such who have not reached the age of 19. Um, these surgeries, by the way, are exceedingly rare. So this is an example of something that President Trump has raised the visibility of to a great degree, far, far beyond the number of people who are actually impacted. The estimates are anywhere between 0.5% to maybe 3%. Um, but but what we're seeing here in Connecticut is, I think it's more of their agenda and Trump's agenda coinciding, as opposed to the Connecticut Republicans waking up on January 21st and said, we're going to put all these bills in that we have never, ever talked about before, because that would be inaccurate. Take immigration. Connecticut has something called the Trust Act. The original version passed in 2013 was passed unanimously, if I recall correctly, certainly overwhelming support from both parties. And the idea was to make people feel comfortable in calling the police, even if they were undocumented. There was a revision in 2019 after Donald Trump had been talking about deportations and whatnot, to spell out what law enforcement in Connecticut could and could not do in concert with immigration agents. And it's fairly complicated, but the short answer is, if the feds come in with a judicial warrant, a warrant signed by a judge to hand over somebody, there's no ifs, ands, and buts about it. There is that degree of cooperation. But, there's a lot of misinformation about whether Connecticut is a sanctuary state, which is a term that really does not have a legal definition. And there's also misinformation about what states and municipalities must do when the feds come knocking. There are restrictions on the feds. It's called commandeering. They cannot force state and municipal agents to become their agents. And that is the root of some of the conflict. So there's an effort, there's a Republican bill that would repeal those elements of the Trust Act. But again, this is something that the Republicans did not support when these elements were added to the Trust Act in 2019. It'd be inaccurate to say this is them bowing to Donald Trump. These were ideas they didn't much like in 2019 when they were enacted.
And of course, just to be fair, when it comes to any sort of potential legislation that's put forward by Republicans that would ban transgender care or would weaken the Trust Act, the chances are incredibly small that anything like that passes or changes in Connecticut during this legislative session, certainly. So, on the flip side, what are Democrats doing about all this? I mean, certainly we've heard that many Democrats at the state capitol would like to strengthen provisions to make sure that there are rights for transgender people in the state. They would like to strengthen provisions to make sure that it's clear that this is a state where, if you are an undocumented immigrant, you are not going to be turned over by local authorities. So what are Democrats doing in response to some of what Donald Trump has put forward?
So far, the Democrats have been more intent on explaining what the law is in Connecticut and why it is defensible, why it is not at conflict necessarily with federal law. So there have been advocates who have called for strengthening somehow protections for transgender people. It's not quite clear how that would work. And the same thing with advocates who want to strengthen the Trust Act, it's already quite strong. So that's unclear at this point. I have not seen actual legislative language that would explain how they would do that. When it comes to transgender people, Connecticut nationally is considered one of the safest states to be if you're transgender. Connecticut has a long history of protections in the LGBTQ community in general. You know, Connecticut was a state that where without prodding from a court, you know, they adopted essentially marriage rights. They were initially called civil unions, but you know that goes back 20 years. And even before that, there was protections in housing and employment based on sexual orientation. So, I mean, this is a state that has been pretty strong in those kind of protections. The whole world of protecting um, transgender kids and adults is newer and is evolving. But Connecticut does have some strong protections in law as far as recognizing people, um, their gender as they so identify.
So let's talk about some things. And again, I promise that our entire legislative preview isn't going to be about Donald Trump in Washington. But the fact is, Paz, that there's an awful lot of stuff to react to. And I think some things that you've seen stories in the Connecticut Mirror, your colleagues have written about, and you've been looking at as well, is that it's a little bit unclear how Donald Trump and the administration plans to deal with states around things like healthcare, education, transportation. There's a lot of things that Connecticut and the other 49 states rely on from the federal government. And it's super unclear what that's going to look like. And frankly, whether or not someone like Elon Musk is going to have a gigantic hand in figuring out whether or not dollars can go to different places within the country. So, what are Democrats doing as you think about that issue and whether or not the dollars are going to come in to pay for some of the things Connecticut expects the federal government to pay for?
Well, we're speaking on the eve of the governor presenting his budget to the General Assembly, and that's been a question we have asked him over and over, and he's been fairly careful in answering that question, other than saying he's trying to build in a little bit of flexibility because as you said, there's a lot of confusion. Those first and second day and third day executive orders, there was a freeze on federal funds. It seemed to be far more reaching than they finally, defined it a little bit more precisely. But yes, the bottom line is there's a lot of confusion. One of the short-term impacts in Connecticut has been it has become partisan in a way that the Connecticut General Assembly quite often is not. When the contrast between the General Assembly and Congress was so sharp on opening day, where Matt Ritter, the Democratic Speaker of the House, the nominating speech was delivered by the House Republican leader. And in the Senate, the seconding speech for the Senate President Pro Tem Martin Looney was delivered by the Republican leader. And so the vibe in Hartford, they will play hardball from time to time, but it was very noteworthy how the House Republican leader Vincent Candelora responded, not so much defending Trump by name, but criticizing the Democrats for what he said was panicking and fear mongering. Um, he said, take a breath. Taking a breath probably was good advice, suggesting that this was just a transition to a new administration and this was not out of the norm. Perhaps that was a bit of a reach for Mr. Candelora to suggest, because this has been extraordinary on so many ways.
Excuse me. Let's talk for a minute about the governor and what exactly he is proposing, the things that he's expecting to spend more money on in his budget this year. Of course, we'll be talking about a lot of this with Keith Phaneuf next week, but we have heard quite a bit and talked quite a bit in the Connecticut Mirror about some of the fiscal constraints that Governor Lamont has supported over the years, which have led to some better economic times. But there's an awful lot of people within his own party who are saying there are substantial needs within the state that need to be funded. And I guess I'm wondering where you read the governor as right now in terms of making decisions about loosening up some of the purse strings, and how exactly he'd do that given the fiscal guardrails that we have in place.
The governor seems to be quite adamant on at least some of the caps. So Connecticut has, call it belts and suspenders approach, but there are these intertwined restrictions on spending in Connecticut. And I'll leave to Keith to go into capology. But I mean, the basic thing is there is a spending cap that's tied to inflation and income growth. There's also a volatility cap, which was passed when the General Assembly was pretty close to 50-50. And the import of the volatility cap is, by the way, when the volatility cap was passed, nobody in Connecticut knew what a surplus looked like because we hadn't seen one in God knows how long. But so it was sort of a theoretical thing. We will have this protection.
What if we had a surplus? What would that look like?
And that on the more volatile streams of revenue, which tend to be, the people who file quarterly, and it reflects what's going on in Wall Street and certain business filings that tend to go up and down. And Connecticut has had a pattern. Graphically, it looks like, I don't know if you remember Charlie Brown's sweaters, where it was up, down, and that's what's that's what revenue and spending would look like. We do high tech graphics at the Connecticut.
I almost wore that sweater, but I decided to go with the Mr. Rogers tonight. Anyway, please continue.
We should get Faniff to wear it when he does.
Yeah, exactly.
But anyway, so the idea is you want to avoid what the governor is fond of calling yo-yoing, right? Makes sense. But what's happened is since the governor's really first year, the volatile revenue sources have not been that volatile for the last 6 years. They've been pretty good. So here's the tension that sets up. And of course, a little bit of history. If anybody's on this call, well understands that Connecticut has a horrible history of fiscal mismanagement, particularly when it comes to pensions. This state started offering state employees pensions going back to 1939, and they didn't think it was important to set any money aside and invest it in the market until recent decades. And that has created this huge unfunded pension liability. So the volatility cap has resulted in a lot of money being set aside for budget reserve. The rainy day fund budget reserves is now full. We have 18% money in the bank, 18% of the general fund money in the bank. It's a good hedge if things go south. And then the other thing is Connecticut's been putting another $1 billion or so a year paying down these pension debts, which have been very, very important. But the tension is in a time when you have $1 billion that's getting socked away in the bank, you do have what both parties acknowledge are unmet needs. One example would be Medicaid reimbursements. It's very hard for Medicaid recipients to find certain kinds of doctors. And whether you're Democrat or Republican, everybody acknowledges that Connecticut should really do something about that. And in fact, Democratic legislators proposed the other day phasing in, updating the reimbursement rates, which are only 57% of Medicare rates, and Medicare rates aren't exactly the richest either. And so the idea would be to phase in increases over 3 years to get to about 75%. Well, that's going to run into the spending cap. And we were reminded of that the other day when Governor Lamont released his proposal to put more money into special education at the state level. This is a huge issue for cities and towns. This is a big and growing expense in school systems. And the governor recommended or proposed putting, $40 million into reimbursements. It's called excess cost grants, and another 10 million into some programming stuff. But what was noteworthy is none of it is going to go into the budget he's going to propose tomorrow for the first year of it. It's all going to be in the second year. And what does that mean? Well, there's no room under the spending cap. So here you have the governor saying, this is important. I'm putting my name behind it. But yet he's also saying it doesn't fit under the cap. So we're going to do it in the second. So
It's not going to happen this year.
So that's Ned Lamont putting a marker down that he's going to be kind of a hard ass on the spending cap. He has expressed some a little bit of flexibility on the volatility cap, but again, these things work in tandem. So what exactly he's talking about and how much more money that would free up is unclear at this point.
I just want to remind everyone who's on this call, if you've got questions for Mark Pazniokas, I was gonna have a call-in number, Paz. I almost went into my whole spiel like on the radio, but instead just go to the bottom of the screen and hit the Q&A button, and you can ask some questions. Paz, if you're ready, I'm just going to go through a couple of these questions that people have ready about a whole bunch of things, and we'll get back to some of the politics in just a minute. Here's actually a question about the governor. Has Governor Lamont maintained his debt diet? And maybe you can describe what the debt diet is. It's not like the Atkins diet.
No, it's more like the intermittent fasting. You don't.
I like that. Yes.
And then at night you bond a lot. So the debt diet, when he came in, he looked at Connecticut's indebtedness and he said, we're going to go on a debt diet. And he did to a degree. There was a fair amount of tension between the governor and the Democratic majority because the governor stopped holding bond commission meetings. So the way it works, the legislature puts things into a bond package. We're going to borrow money to do X. And sometimes it's things that everybody agrees, we have to rebuild that bridge or it's going to fall down. But then there's a lot of, smaller things, local projects. Some may be, very worthwhile. Others may be a little bit more questionable. And one of the things that came out of that tension was the creation of this something called the Community Investment Fund, where there was a process created where instead of just one legislator who has influence on the bond package sticking in something for his district, there was a process of it was a competitive process, and there was a review, and the governor felt comfortable with it because he thought there was some overall planning and some purpose to these things. But the governor has freed up, he's been a little bit looser on borrowing, in part because the Biden administration put a lot of money out, and some of that stuff did require matching funds or at least some state participation. So he has been tighter than some previous governors, but it has not been that onerous a diet. I've been on diets before. This one's not that bad.
This one's not that bad. This is actually a very, very practical question that came in early, and I think it's an important one. You talked about the 3,100 bills that have been proposed so far. Well, before I ask their question, how many do we have by the end of the session? If it's 3,000 now, like what's a good number to expect?
Yeah, I should have looked that up. It's usually at the end, there's maybe 200, 300 laws that are passed. So 10% of where they are now. And again, there's a lot of duplication in this stuff. But yeah, they'll, at the end, there'll be a couple hundred new laws at least.
and maybe a couple thousand more bills thrown out there. So the question is, where can I find the list of the legislation that's being considered? Like if I wanted to look through all 3,100, this person wants to know where would I go? Where would I go find those things?
Go to cga.ct.gov, and the General Assembly has a pretty good website where you can track things. Um, the first time you go there, it's a little intimidating. Um, Once the bills are filed, they're then referred to committees. So you can go to each committee, and there's something called the bill book, and you can look at that. I was looking at it today, and like you can see which committees are the busiest this time. Like Judiciary, I think there's 250 or 60 bills, um, and you can sort them that way, and you'll see that some of the titles are the same, but you see who sponsored them, and then you can track them. You'll see, has any action been taken? Has there been a vote to formally draft them? Because one of the things about the Connecticut General Assembly, and this I'm not really criticizing, it's just how the process works. People will look to see a fully formed bill to make some judgment if this is a good idea, bad idea. But what you'll see, they're really more statements of intent. And the Senate Democrats, for example, have proposed what they hope will be major bills on energy costs and on housing development, right? Connecticut has, again, everybody agrees there is a dire need for more housing. And the Democratic bill, as written right now, it requires the general statutes to be amended to ensure there's fair and equitable opportunities for housing in each one of Connecticut's 169 cities and towns. And that's all it says.
Oh,
How we will
yeah.
get this miracle is to be determined. And similarly, on an energy bill, there's a bill that says the general statute shall be amended to ensure that Connecticut will have reliable and affordable electricity, which
Oh, isn't that nice?
it
That
is nice.
sounds good.
It is nice. And how we're going to get there, we'll find out.
So, okay, but now that's a really good point. So, when you're talking about these 3,000 bills, a certain number of the bills are just these statements of intent. So then what happens? Because obviously, Democrats in these cases would actually like to figure out ways to bring down the cost of electricity. They'd actually like to figure out a way to create more affordable housing for people. But the how exactly isn't in there. So, how do we get from the we think this is a great idea to let's actually do something about it?
So on the energy issue, Senator Norm Needleman, who is the co-chair of the Energy and Technology Committee, he was quite open about the fact that this is really a process and that we are now going to be inviting as many ideas as people have, and we're going to look to develop it. But when it comes to energy, Connecticut only regulates a small portion of what we see in our electric bills. It's the distribution part. It's how electricity is delivered to our homes on the wires that Eversource and United Illuminating own. Connecticut largely deregulated the generation of electricity in a law passed in 1998. And so there are market forces that determine that. So on both energy and on housing, the laws of supply and demand are fairly immutable. Land in Connecticut is expensive, will remain expensive. There are some things you can do. You can nudge communities to ease up a little bit on zoning, maybe streamline approval processes a bit. In the case of the state, perhaps provide money when it comes to affordability to blend low interest state money with market rate money, that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, there's only so much the legislature can do on these things. And legislators quite often don't like acknowledging that.
Not to put too fine a point on it. Yeah. Okay.
And there's also a belief that, all the world's annoyances, small and large, can be resolved legislatively. There are two bills that are not related directly, but the concept is the same. One of them is a bill that would require greater transparency in the actual starting time of a movie. So you don't have to sit through all the coming attractions. And that's a bill that was filed. Um, in a similar vein, there's a bill that would mandate that hospitals somehow post real-time waits in emergency departments. And maybe you could meld the two together and show movies while they're waiting to be treated.
How would that even be accomplished? Well, it's so fascinating hearing about these things. Well, okay, since we're talking about healthcare only tangentially, let's get to another one. We have someone asking, do you know if there are any bills that will address senior services, specifically the Connecticut Home Care for Elders program through DSS, as it relates to increases in payment reimbursement to home care agencies contracted to provide services? We've been talking about Medicaid, Medicare rates. There's a lot of shortfalls here. What do you know about senior services?
Specifically, I do not know about that. I can say broadly, reimbursement rates are always part of a budget debate. So we'll find out tomorrow what changes, if any, have been recommended by the Lamont administration reimbursements. But I'm sorry, I don't have that level of detail about that program in particular.
Okay, a different question. How likely is it the lawmakers will pass a bill restructuring the CCSU system? Perhaps going back to the separation of the Connecticut state colleges and the community colleges. Is this something that people are thinking about, talking about with some of the issues that have happened around the CCSU system? CSCU system?
Realistically, that would require the governor deciding to push. It requires a singular and very loud voice to do that. The governor so far has been fairly protective of the system, even in light of some very critical and very good reporting by my old colleague, Jacqueline Rape Thomas, who now works for Hearst. And so, yes, there are bills that are filed. I have not seen anything that shows there's political muscle behind it. And that's a polite way of saying these mainly been Republican bills, not entirely, but individual legislators kind of taking a poke at the system. There's one that would abolish the Board of Regents, which oversees that system, but it would replace it with two boards of trustees for the four-year colleges and the community colleges. So I'm not sure what we get out of that. But yes, there's a fair amount of disappointment in that system. And the governor from time to time has dropped these little suggestions that he is unhappy with the University of Connecticut and the CCSU system. He has said there are states where tuitions are lower and they seem to be doing quite fine. Now, he has never followed up, even in response to polite questioning from myself and others, as to, well, what does that mean? Are you gonna hit him in the budget? We'll find out tomorrow.
Interesting. Okay, so let's go to another question that we're getting here. And again, you can ask questions of Paz with the Q&A little button at the bottom here. I'll try to get to as many as I can. What's the likelihood, this person writes, of a child tax credit passing that emulates what was available during COVID, e.g., here, some $600 a child, payable monthly? Is that something that's on the table that you know of?
Democrats have pushed for it. The governor does not see it as something Connecticut can afford right now. What your questioner referred to was the federal child tax credit that Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro was instrumental in passing. Unfortunately, it was temporary and it expired. and it had an incredible impact. Most of the data I showed indicated it reduced childhood poverty by 45, 46, 47%. There's not a lot of legislation that can claim that kind of impact. Connecticut does have an earned income tax credit, which under Governor Lamont, it has grown larger. So the governor has talked in terms of helping lower income folks with tax cuts at the low and middle income level. And again, the earned income tax credit, which has become more valuable. But no, right now, it is a child tax credit, certainly on par with what the feds had briefly, does not seem to be in the works.
This is one of my little hobby horse questions that someone asks, where is no excuse mail-in voting in the legislative process?
Well, we have no excuse absentee ballots. We have early voting. Um, it's I don't know what else. I mean, other than going to a state like I think Colorado, everything is done by mail. And so in a
There,
couple of
there
West
are states that have basically moved to mail-in voting almost entirely. Yeah.
and Connecticut, there's been constitutional amendments that have given the General Assembly latitude on first early voting and now no excuse absentee voting. The General Assembly has not, however, and the governor has not, however, been particularly generous in providing funding to the municipalities to make early voting go a little smoother. Um, Connecticut has no counties. Elections in Connecticut are a municipal function. There are 169 election systems in Connecticut. And my latest information is there's not going to be money in the budget that comes out tomorrow to reimburse cities and towns for voting.
Okay, so I mean I think that part of the answer is there, right? If you follow the money, it doesn't seem as though the state wants to pay for the thing that seemingly has worked pretty well. What's the temperature in the room, Paz? Now that we've finally gotten past this antiquated version of voting that almost no other state was doing, where you had to show up on a certain day and you couldn't make an excuse. I mean, we finally got somewhere close to the 21st century, and it's worked, it seems, to get people turning out. How do lawmakers think about this new world, or do they just not think about it at all?
I th- I think there's been a degree of acceptance pretty quickly. And this became partisan during COVID. It became emblematic of what Republicans complained were too many powers being delegated by the General Assembly to the governor. Another complicating factor is President Trump, who equated anything other than showing up at the polls during the day as rife with fraud. And there's some indication he may have been the instrument of his own undoing when he lost in 2020, because he had turned off Republicans from early voting and absentee voting, which in other parts of the country, there were Republican county organizations that had great get out the vote machines using absentee ballots and early voting. And these became tainted. And we saw it in Connecticut because you could see not necessarily the individuals, but it was very easy to see who was voting by AB, whether they were Democrat, a Republican, or an unaffiliated voter. And it was definitely weighted towards Democrats.
Hmm. Certainly, whenever we have these conversations, I get a lot of questions in advance about what the state is going to do to combat climate change and how quickly Connecticut might move toward a transition to a bigger electric vehicle fleet. Essentially, making the state more friendly to electric vehicles. I guess my question, Paz, is what are you hearing from the governor, from legislators about climate change, about EVs, and how does Donald Trump and some of the things he's talked about around renewable energy and climate change, how does that impact what they're thinking?
Well, the very short answer is we're hearing more about resiliency than we are about mitigation. There seems to be, at least short term, a surrender to a warming planet. And now there's a shift towards, um, you
How
know,
cheery.
towards building an ark. So last year, the governor filed a resiliency bill that did not get through, and there was also a significant climate change bill, which was more based on incentives, trying to get folks to do things like heat and cool their homes with heating pumps that are very, very efficient, but they do add. They're run by electricity, and they do add to the burden on the grid. Um, and anybody who signed up for this probably is well aware of what happened with electric vehicles. Connecticut long has adhered to the California clean air standards, right? There are two, or at least they were when we started. I don't know by the end of the day what's left, but there were two basic standards. There were the EPA standards, which were produced by an environmentalist called Richard M. Nixon, and who also was instrumental at letting California have tougher standards. So there are two standards. You could go with the federal standard, or you could voluntarily adhere to the more stringent California standards. So the California standards, a year ago, they shifted to a far more aggressive timetable to try to encourage the transition to electric vehicles. There was a lot of misinformation about this, that those standards would have forced people to get rid of their gas-powered cars. But it did set a timetable for new vehicles of how soon could we get to, when you went to a showroom, that the only vehicles that still burn gas would be hybrids, plug-in hybrids in particular. Republicans oppose that for a variety of reasons, saying the grid's not set up for more and more electric vehicles. And it was also a question of choice. What was different with this approach than what, say, the feds have done traditionally on fuel efficiency standards, they would apply to the whole fleet that was for sale. And so if you still wanted to buy your pickup truck that got 12 miles to the gallon, you could do it because it was going to be offset by your neighbor who was driving that damn Prius, getting 50 miles to the gallon. So this was a different approach. So the Republicans raised hell about it initially, but it quickly became clear that there was a lot of misgivings about it. The Black and Puerto Rican caucus, for example, all Democrats, mainly urban constituencies, but not exclusively, raised questions about how practical this timetable was. Folks who lived in cities in an apartment, are you really going to be able to find a place to plug in? And affordability on electric vehicles, although the price has been coming down, and there are some lower cost versions that are out there. But that became a non-starter in Connecticut. Even with the backing of the governor, they could not pass the regulations to implement that tougher California standards. I don't want to go too deep in the weeds, but Connecticut has an unusual way of doing regulations. It's bipartisan. So if all the Republicans were opposed and you get one or two more conservative Democrats, which is what happened, you're not going to get the regulations through. So the governor has pretty much given up on going back to the California standards, even though there may not be any federal standards by the end of the year. We'll see. So the governor is now
Yeah,
focused on resilience.
yeah. It seems as though, yeah, a lot of the country is going to be focused on resilience over the course of the next couple of years. Here's a very direct, specific question. Is there any chance of a reduction in the state income tax?
Not in the governor's budget. He's made clear he's not proposing that. The Republicans have proposed a cut that they would finance in part by having a freeze on state employee wages and doing some other things. The problem with
That
in-
seems unlikely.
it does seem
Sorry to interrupt you.
well, particularly if they went to binding arbitration, particularly at a time when the state is banking $1 billion a year. It's because, ability to pay is one of the things that's factored into that. So it does become.
It kind of seems like a non-starter, but anyway, I'm sorry. Please
The
continue.
last time we had long periods of pay freezes was when the state clearly had no money and Dan Malloy was basically at war with everybody, including state employees. And to keep the state together, he cut spending, froze wages, and also raised taxes because that's how bad those years were after the 2008 recession. But the bigger problem with anytime you cut the income tax, because it's so broad based, even a modest tax cut costs the state a lot of money. And so the governor did one not so long ago, but no, he's not looking at one tomorrow.
Okay, so we just have a couple minutes left, and we do have a lot of questions to get to, but I do have to get to a couple of things that I know that you'd want to talk about, Paz, that I think are important here. Each legislative session, there are some things that keep coming back over and over again. Either they get acted on, or as we say, they sort of incrementally go down the road. Things, talk about things like a bear hunt in the state, right? But then sometimes there's some new stuff that lawmakers are talking about. I guess I'm wondering specifically around the questions of artificial intelligence. Is there something that Connecticut lawmakers are actually grappling with this time around, this session, that's maybe a little bit different than what you've seen in the past?
There is a very detailed bill on artificial intelligence. Senator James Maroney, who has turned himself into really a national expert on this, but he's been at odds with the governor on whether a state, particularly one the size of Connecticut, should be in the business of trying to set standards that would apply nationally. I mean, you can take a really simple business regulation, labeling on packages, right? The industry always says we need one standard. We don't care how tough it is, but give us one. you know. So the problem with a bill that the Senate did pass and that the governor was opposed to, it was requiring anybody who was working with AI to ensure that whatever they did was not resulting in discriminatory algorithms on things that would determine who could get loans, who could get whatever. I mean, this stuff is becoming so ubiquitous. And the industry said, we really don't know what that standard means, and we don't know how to meet it. So the governor had threatened to veto that if that reached his desk. And that's where we are today. The governor is still very dubious about how deeply Connecticut should get into AI regulation, as opposed to maybe giving a few years and we'll just ask Chat GPT to come up with good regulations for itself.
Heck, in a couple of years, we won't have to do this legislative preview, Paz. We can just plug in a couple numbers, and I think just a couple of bearded avatars can have at it and talk for an hour or so. Well, okay. One of the things I've always loved about your reporting is that, because you're a political reporter, you sort of try to look at, the whole picture of what's happening. So yeah, there's 3,000 bills to look at, and you've got to track these things, but you're always looking for some sort of a narrative. At this point right now, a couple of years out from a governor who may go for re-election, couple days into a Donald Trump presidency and what havoc it may be causing at the state or local level. What's like the thesis that you're kind of working with? What's the overarching story that you're looking at for this Connecticut legislative session?
Well, again, as I said earlier, the basic identity of the parties, and that's sort of an evolving thing. When it comes to the governor, that's not a couple years off. That is probably a couple months off about him indicating if he's going or not. And quite frankly, I'm getting tired of kind of looking through the tea leaves because, he just hired a former aide, Rob Blanchard, came back to oversee communication. So people go, oh, okay, Rob came back. Does that mean that Ned is committed to running? Well, I don't think that is the case. But those are the things everybody looks at. And the governor, it was a bad year, bad election in November for urban turnout in Connecticut. And when it was time for a new Democratic Party chair, he picked the mayor of Danbury. So it's like, oh, okay, is this a sign that he is now looking at trying to see what he can do with the urban vote? Does that mean he's more inclined to run? Most people I talk to, people used to have stronger opinions one way or the other. It was 60-40 or 70-30. He was or wasn't. Now everybody I talk to seems to be, it's 51-49 and, you pick them. So
at least one of our questioners actually put something in there that goes back to our voting question before, which is maybe if the state spent a little bit of money making sure that people in urban areas understood exactly how this new voting system works, then maybe more people would turn out, because it was pretty damn confusing this last time. And it seems as though that might be money well spent by a governor who'd like to have turnout in the cities. Don't you think?
yes, and there was, and forgive me, I can't recall if it was Hamden. There was a municipality that put some local money into it, and their turnout was much better as far as the early voting. So yes, education does work. But yeah, well, we'll see. But as far as the political narrative, I mean, that's going to be the big one. People are going to be going over this budget tomorrow with an eye towards, is the governor staying on reasonably good terms with the various constituencies? And right now, will he find workarounds on the spending cap? As Faniff will be able to tell you at the next thing on the budget, there are workarounds, there are gimmicks. We'll see. That's going to be part of tomorrow, looking at the budget with that in mind, about, is this a politically defensible budget? What we've seen in the buildup to this budget is really the governor talking more about, this is what I've done in the previous years in these areas. There has been, significant funds putting into housing construction, for example, and he has reminded us that of time and time again. But voters, they want to know what you're doing now and what you're going to do tomorrow, and he has been constrained by the various spending caps.
Yeah, it's funny. Of course, I said this a couple of years off, but I guess I'm still signing my checks 2024. I need to get with the times, Paz. It's already 2025. Mark Pazniokas is the Capitol Bureau Chief of the Connecticut Mirror. Paz, it's always great to talk to you, especially on the eve of this budget as we start off this legislative session. Thanks so much for spending some time with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We can, of course, read more of Mark Pazniokas' work throughout the course of this legislative session at ctmirror.org. There's a big red button in the upper right-hand corner that says donate, and that's how you support the work of Mark Pazniokas and Keith Faniff and all the other great reporters at the Connecticut Mirror. So a week from tomorrow, Keith Faniff will have plenty of time to digest everything that's in the governor's budget. And we'll be talking with him just in this space about his big budget review. So you can sign up for that. It's always great fun. Of course, we've got other great events. You can go to our events page at ctmirror.com.org/events, and you can find out more about those. We also have lots of sponsors to thank, including our presenting sponsor, the Mohican Tribe, our accountability sponsors, Eversource, and CBIA. The publishing sponsors, Express Strategies, Clifton Larson Allen, Hinckley Allen, Rowthorne Law, LLC, and the Causeway Agency. Thank you so much to Robert DeGioia and Gabby DeBenedictis for making this happen. Thank you to our publisher, Bruce Putterman. And thanks to all of you for spending an hour or so talking about legislative stuff. It's what we do here at the Connecticut Mirror. 15 years of this stuff because of you. Thanks so much. Have a great night.